So I feel like I've been waiting for the Xlite V3 for years at this point. Now it's finally in my hands. I bought the eSports medium version and I have a lot to say about this one. So is my copy everything I wanted it to be? Let's find out. So I'll stick the specs up on screen so you can see that detail if you're interested. It is a really feature-packed mouse, so bear that in mind as I go through this review. And while you're reading that, don't forget to like the video, and if you're new to the channel, maybe consider subscribing. So let's start with the buttons. Mouse 1 and 2 feel quite nice to me. They're optical switches, so they aren't quite as crisp or tactile as my Zowie or my Vaxi mice, but they feel good and the tensioning is really great too. There's not much pre or post travel on my unit. The shape of mouse 1 and 2 are also awesome, and this kind of acts as a channel for your fingers to rest in, and I really like this element of the design. The side buttons also feel good. They're nice and chunky, and they feel tactile enough in use. I don't have a lot more to say about that. The scroll wheel makes me feel some kind of way though, and I really don't understand why you would use an aluminium scroll wheel on a mouse intended for esports, because this thing is really not grippy at all. It almost feels like there's input latency on the scrolling function because of how much it slips under my finger when I scroll it. I know I could learn to press harder on the wheel when I scroll it, but in my previous reviews for Vaxi mice, I've mentioned how effortless the buttons are to use. And the Pulsar scroll wheel provides the opposite experience for me. I feel like I'm actually at a disadvantage with this aluminium scroll wheel, and I personally don't like it at all. I find the actual functions of the scroll wheel to be pretty great though. The scroll feels a little loose when compared to other mice, but it is nice and defined enough that I wouldn't scroll it by accident. And the actuation of mouse 3, so the scroll wheel, is really light. There's hardly any travel for the button to actuate, and I really like that a lot. I wish more mice would take that approach. The button actuation on mouse 3 feels quite unique on the V3 ES. I just wish it had a rubberized material. I guess I'm just a bit of a light scroller, which is never anything I'd considered before being a problem, but I don't personally want to invest the energy into adapting to using the aluminium surface. I'm normally very quick to adapt to new kit and innovative approaches, but this material on the scroll wheel just feels off to me. I recognise that's all personal preference, and some people online have said they love it, so bear that in mind. This is all just my experience with the mouse. That's enough said, let's move on. The coating of the mouse is also really, really nice. It feels very similar to the Zowie coating to me, which is huge praise because I love that coating. I don't need any grip tape on the Xlite V3 ES, which is fantastic. The stock skates were also fine, but I chose to switch them out to the Ghost Glide Vortexes because I'm enjoying those a lot at the moment, and you can see that review in the description down below. There's also a screen on the bottom of the mouse, which is a nice feature, although it is quite fancy. It actually allows you to manage the mouse's settings on the mouse itself. There's no need for software on the computer, which is awesome, and it also holds your hand a bit and will display the settings in an intuitive form rather than through a series of flashing or different coloured lights, which is the system used on Vaxi and Zowie mice currently. And just to bring that to light a bit, whenever I change the settings on my Vaxi or my Zowie mice, I typically have to reference an online guide to remind myself what the colours mean and what the different flashing sequences mean. That's why it's useful to have it all in an intuitive format on the Xlite V3 ES, recognising that I don't really change my settings that often. It's just nice to have it there. The whole build quality of this mouse is really such a great leap when compared to the previous Xlite V2. The V3 is completely rigid and there is no play at all in the shell. The Xlite V3 ES weighs about 65 grams on my scales, which is quite a nice weight that will accommodate a lot of gamers' preferences. It feels nicely balanced to me too, which is more important than the weight in my opinion, and I can't personally notice the screen causing an issue for the weight balancing of the mouse, but other reviewers have mentioned it in their coverage, so maybe watch a few other reviews before you decide to pull the trigger on this one. It may or may not be an issue for you. There is another observation I want to talk through though, and I have noticed some issues when I use this mouse on my work computer. Now, I typically have an electronic device orgy on my desk while I work, and I might have my work laptop on one side of the desk, my personal laptop on the other side of the desk, maybe streaming music. I'll have my mobile phone on the mouse pad, and then I'll have 3 or 4 mice surrounding my mouse pad, which I'll have played with either that night or that day. So when I use the Pulsar V3 ES in that environment, I notice some sensor tracking issues. It's like the sensor gets stuck or the cursor doesn't want to move every now and then, and this is very disruptive while I'm working. I'm running the mouse on 1K polling rates like all my other mice, and I have never had this issue before. I felt it warranted being mentioned, but I do not have this issue while I play actual video games in the evening, because I typically clear my desk when I play games because I need the space. So I feel this is just an interference issue with all those electronic devices around at the same time. So to summarize the specs and build quality, the Xlite V3 ES is a great mouse. I personally just can't get over the scroll wheel being so awkward to use, but I know that others have said how much they love it, so this could very well just be me and my awkward preferences at play. It just feels a bit too slippery to me. Also, the interference issue I've mentioned feels a bit disappointing. I'd love to see someone with a more technical skill set break this down and provide the root cause of that issue. So I want to talk now about the shape and how it changed from the V2 to the V3. And I've been using the V2 a lot recently, so I could instantly feel the difference when the V3 arrived. Some of these observations aren't really visible. They're just things that you can feel when you pick up the mice and compare the contact points that you make during playtime. So the thumb area on the V2 feels a bit rounder to me. So when I grip these mice, I tend to wrap my thumb around the hips and press it right into my first thumb knuckle. It is a touch straighter in this area on the V3. It doesn't quite press into the meat of my thumb as much as the V2 does. So that's the first change. The second change is in the top right corner of the V3. It feels like there's less of an accent in that top right hand corner. The V2 has a little bump on the top right hand corner, much like the C series does, but they've toned that down this time. And this new V3 approach allows a really seamless connection with the mouse with the pinky and ring finger. So the third change is in the middle of the hump. So the middle of the hump on the V3 is a little more rounded than it is on the V2. The V2 sat quite neatly inside my palm, and it was very comfortable, and it felt quite passive in my palm. Possibly not the right word to use. But the V3 fills my hand out a little more. It's a touch wider on the hump and therefore feels a bit more noticeable in my hand. The final change between these two models is that the right hand side of the mouse feels a slight bit more noticeable to me. It feels a little fuller where your pinky rests than it does on the V2. So I gravitate towards Ergo's asymmetrical mice because I enjoy that little bump on the right hand side. This mouse delivers on that element really nicely. So that's all the different shape changes that I've recognised. I'd be interested to hear if you notice those changes too. So I personally really appreciate that Pulsar are making these adjustments to their shapes. It feels kind of rough sometimes when a company copies another company's shape like for like. And the V2 felt like a direct clone of the EC2. Whereas the V3 now feels like it's breaking away from that EC mold a bit, and I can certainly tell the difference between those shapes now, which is great to see. Finally, let's talk about whether the Xlite V3 ES is a good product for the price. The V3 ES is going for about £120, which I feel is actually a great price for the features on this mouse. The specs at this price point are also unmatched by its competitors. So the 4K dongle is included in the box. You can go up to 8K polling rate when wired. It has the latest 3395 sensor, it has well implemented optical switches, it has a cool and functional screen display on the mouse, and the overall aesthetic is also a great selling point. For me though, with my preferences, that scroll wheel is a big turn off for me, and the interference issues I'm experiencing while working is just a bit of a shame. So for that reason, I'd suggest this might be a great mouse for you, but I'd recommend you consider your options wisely before you commit to a purchase. You may actually receive a superior product when buying the normal Xlite V3 for a very competitive price of £85, there or thereabouts. You know, it won't have the weird scroll wheel, which again, is my preference. It'll be a lot cheaper, a touch lighter, and although it will only be capable of 1K polling rate out of the box, you know, that's perfectly fine with me. Medium ergos at £120 have a lot of stiff competition. In the UK, the Xlite V3 ES costs the same as the EC2CW and the VAXI AX. So while I accept the specs and features of the Xlite V3 ES are currently superior to the VAXI and the Zowie mice, I'm not yet convinced that the Xlite V3 ES is a superior product overall. I do recognise though that Pulsar are quite rapidly closing the gap on those leading brands in terms of quality. If they make the same leap in build quality next year, they could well be at the top of the game, legitimately. All right, that's it. Chat soon. Thank you. Bye.